Hello, welcome back to I Got Board Game. It is Friday, and today we are reviewing a pretty special game, pretty different game, and that is, John,
The stock market,
the
because
stock
stocks are so
market,
important.
the
What a
game of
game.
games. No, we are reviewing
Stockpile.
Stockpile. So this is like a big box game. And so Stockpile is, it is a stock market game, but don't be fooled whether you like the stock market or don't like the stock market, because it is a game. And so it approaches it a certain way. So in Stockpile, the theme is basically you are a private investor, and it's a game of manipulating the market, insider trading, and
Insider trading.
insider trading and selling stocks and bidding on and buying stocks. So that's the theme. And so I will go into a very quick overview, not the whole game, how to play it, but quick overview. So hopefully you'll understand when we're talking about different parts of the game. And so let me pull up the image of the game set up. Okay, so this is an image of the game set up for 4 players. You have the main board, which tracks the companies and the price of their stocks. You have the section on the bottom, these calculators, which are for bidding on stockpiles. You have each player with their own colored uh, portfolio board with some of their money and their insider information, and their portfolio board has their stocks face down on it. And so basically the way the game begins is everyone kind of starts with a random stock of one of these 6 companies. There's, what's it? I can't read it right now.
Cosmic
Oh
Computers.
yeah, that's right. Cosmic Computer.
Something Bank.
Let me see.
Laboratories,
Yeah,
Automotive,
Leading
Stanford
Labs,
Steel, and
American
Epic Electric.
Auto, Bottom Line Bank, Stanford Steel, Epic Electric. So those are the 6 companies in the game. So all the stocks in the game are for those companies. And the game goes for a certain number of rounds tracked at this calendar up here. Basically, it'll be moving forward in date, starting from a certain date, depending on how many players are playing. And so the game is usually around basically 2 to 4 rounds, depending on the number of players. And each round has 6 phases, but don't get worried about that being complicated. It's basically, each phase is pretty simple. First, you have the forecasting, where everyone is dealt a company card and a forecast card, basically a prediction of how that company stock is going to move at the end of this round, at the end of this day. And so that's your insider information. Only you see it this whole round. And then everyone is dealt out these stock cards, and they're going to basically go in turn order, building piles of stock piles under these calculators. And you're going to put them, the cards that you were just dealt, either face up or face down in any of these piles. And then after these piles are formed by all the cards that were just dealt out, players are going to take turns bidding on these. And basically, one player can only, each stockpile can only be won by one player. So if you put your piece on a bidding like 1K to buy that whole pile of cards, some are face up, some are face down. You might not know what everything is there. Someone can bid higher than you on any of the spaces above it to knock you off and force you to bid on a different pile or bid higher on that same pile. So that's the bidding phase. And then after that, you resolve and pay however much you just bid for that pile. You get all the cards in it. Cards could be stocks mostly, but it also could be trading fees that you have to pay, which are like penalties. They can also be stock boom or stock bust cards, which are the way you manipulate the market. And so if you ended up buying those cards, the next phase is when you're forced to play them, and you can choose which company's stock up here is going to go up or go down, however much the card says. And then after that, you go into a phase where players can choose to sell any of their stocks that they accumulated from the previous phase or from earlier rounds. And you'll be selling them at the prices of whatever the indicator, the black ring is, on for that company. So that's indicating the price of each of their stock. And so the selling phase happens. And then the last phase of the round is you're going to be revealing the forecast, the information you got in the first phase, and you're going to actually move that company's stock price up or down, whatever that forecast was. So that's basically how it works. You'll repeat that process for however many phases there are. And then whoever ended up selling stock or having their stock split, or who has the most stock in a certain company and got money that way, all the different ways you'll get money, that's how you're going to determine the winner at the end of the game. And so that's a very quick overview of Stockpile. And so with that, we will go into talking about the different parts that we like about the game, the pros, the goods.
Yeah, so start us off. It's a really fun game. This is actually a pretty fun game. I think it's because there's different components to the game, especially with the first half of the turns, which is the portfolio or the forecast, then the drafting of the stockpiles that will be purchased, and then the auction bid that happens for that part. I think that's the part that really makes this game shine in my eyes, because that's really like the interactive part where it feels like you're kind of using the insider information that if you know stocks, you legally should not be using if you're doing real stock market games or like doing the actual stock market.
Well, the game taught me to do it though.
But in this game, it's legal and it's great. But it's actually really cool because, right, as you were saying, there's information that is available for everybody to see kind of what is happening with a particular company and its stock value. But then for all of the others, everybody else has some secret information about what's going to happen. So everybody knows that it's either going to go up or down, depending on maybe whatever cards are dealt, and you have one of those pieces of information. So there's a bit of this deduction of the game, right? Analysis deduction of trying to think like, I know I have a really good one, so I'm going to try to bank and manipulate the draft because it seems like people, if people don't have that information, I might be able to find a way to get it for myself. Or like, oh, I know this one's going to die, so I'm going to avoid any kind of stock, right? Trying to buy that one because its cost is so horrendous at this time, right? So I think in that way, when you play the game, especially in that section, that's where a lot of the kind of the feeling of the strategy of deciding what am I going to do or how I'm going to try to get, a particular portfolio or a particular stockpile so I can add it into my portfolio. I find that very fun. And the fact that when you're stacking them, I think, right, it's all face down. Oh, the first one is face up, I think.
Or you can choose.
Or you can choose to show.
Yeah, because everyone's dealt
right.
2 cards from the stock deck, and then basically one of your cards, like you'll play 1 card into a stockpile on your turn,
right, and one has to be up,
and you'll play your second one. Yeah, and so you can choose if your first one is up, then your second one has to be face down.
Yeah,
if your first one's face down, your second one has to be face up.
Yeah. And I think that part of it's really fun, and then it's kind of nice to kind of see the end result of what happens. So like you do all this planning, you do all of it, and then you have to see what happens, right? Because it's like you might have planned for it, but as you were saying, there are certain cards that can change the nature of what happens, even though things were forecast in a certain way, where it still might be affected regardless of all the planning that you did, which is a nice part to the game too, where it's not just whoever can think most analytically about this will always have an advantage, because somebody could be holding a card or place a card in one of the stockpiles that they pick up that completely may change what you were hoping was going to happen with your stock. Like you're like, oh, I'm hoping to maybe get it really cheap, and then it pops up, right? And then I'll be able to make money. But then somebody says, that place is getting bankrupt, and then you lose all your stocks because they busted, and then you're a sad panda.
Yeah, to add to your explanation of like the first phases,
Mhm.
like if you guys look at like John's background, like with the forecast phase, you're basically going to be given one of these company cards, these 6 company cards, and one of these plus or minus cards. So that's how it'll look like. Like that's what the experience will be like. You'll be dealt 2 of these cards, and only you know that information. So you could be given like American Automotive and the +4. So then you know like, okay, this round I want to like get auto auto stock probably, right? Because
Mhm.
that'll be going into next round, that stock's going to be worth a lot more. And then going on to what John said of setting up the stockpiles, so maybe that, you know, you put some auto stock, if you were dealt it, you put some auto stock face down and remember that it's in that stockpile, so you're going to bid more on that one.
And
But then
hopefully
there's,
you remember you put it there,
yeah,
because
you need to
sometimes you
remember
forget.
though. Because but then people might start catching on when it's like you're like bidding on it, like, okay, I'll bid the lowest amount, like 1K, to get this pile that I know has that stock I put in, and then someone outbids you to 3K, and then you're like, no, I'm gonna bid 5, 10K, and then you're like, why are you bidding so much on this pile? What do you know about it? Yeah, that's fun, and I do like the variety of the cards with the stockpile, right? Because not all the cards in the game are just stocks, right? I mentioned
Mhm.
there are trading fees, which is basically a penalty, and you have stock boom or bust cards, and so those are all cards that could be dealt out during the phase when you're creating the stockpiles. And so it kind of mixes it up. So it's not just always looking at what stock you can get, but it's
Mhm.
also being aware of like, you can put trading fees face down. And this has happened quite a bit for me where like people all kind of end up thinking the same thing of putting all these cards face down in this one pile. And it's like 3 of us know that those are like, there's one trading fee in there, meaning
At
the whole
least
pile is
one.
trading
At
fees.
least one, if
And
not
then but the
more.
fourth person doesn't know, and then you're all taking turns bidding, and it's like the 3 of you are doing as much as you can to avoid bidding on that pile because you know it's just gonna be penalties. It's that's a funny moment where it's just like, why are you so scared of this pile? And someone's
I
gonna have to
see
take
you're
it
avoiding putting a
eventually.
bid on this, huh? I see, huh?
And then of course the stock boom and bust cards that you also mentioned like briefly in manipulating the market, right?
Mhm.
That's a really cool mechanic actually I like in the game, because not only do you have a forecast or even play these stock boom or bust cards to move the price of a company's stock, but there is also the mechanic of when the stock reaches its end price, it actually resets, and anyone who has that stock gets to reveal it from their portfolio, like they already had it in front of them. They show that they had it, and it goes onto their right side of their portfolio board. For example, here, you would put your stock face down on this side first when you buy it, but then once that stock splits, you'd move it over here, and it's
Mhm.
essentially the same card, but it counts as 2 of that stock at that
Yep.
point. So moving forward, you have 2 of that one stock now.
Mhm.
And so that's a cool mechanic, where the reverse is if a stock price on the board ever goes down to 0 because of the forecast or because of players playing the stock bust card, everyone who has that stock has to reveal, and all those stock are discarded because the company died.
Including
Yeah,
including
including
the
your split
split
stock.
stocks.
And
So
so that's kind of the nastiness that can happen when you're planning, right? Where it's like, say you got uh was it Epic Electric and you got -2, so you know it's going to drop, and then if you bid in a way to win a stock bust card, and you know preemptively move it down one more so that it's, you know, it needs
it hits
exactly 2
30.
more down to die, then you
Mhm.
just set up that company to die, right? And
Mhm.
I think that's really cool, that's really fun. Those are like tense moments where you're looking at your portfolio and your stock, and you're like, do I have this company's stock? It's like,
Mhm.
oh, please don't die.
Yep. And yeah, I was gonna say the other nice thing about this game too is like it also doesn't necessarily feel like you fall too far behind either. I think that was one of the things I noticed when we played it a few times is even if maybe at the beginning of the game you didn't quite catch on to how the game played or you're trying to learn it, later on, right, because the market and the stocks are fluctuating through these forecasts and the way that it goes, there's a lot of opportunities for players to actually catch up in terms of the stock values and what they're picking up because of also, I think, with the the smartness of the bidding kind of
Hmm.
portfolios that you're allowed to have, because there's always 4 portfolios and everyone can add into each of the portfolios, and they always start with 1, I believe, right?
Yeah. Oh, the
They always have at
stockpiles.
least 1 thing in them to
Yeah,
be
yeah, the stockpiles.
in the stockpiles. And so there's always an opportunity. And as we were talking about with the auction kind of program and format, every player doesn't necessarily want to stack it on one location only, because what happens if you do that is whoever ends up getting that stockpile means that every other stockpile is kind of pretty bare bones, which means nobody's going to want them. And only one player can get one stockpile. So if you can't outbid the person who has that stockpile, you're going to have to pick another stockpile,
Hmm.
period. So you also have to set it up in a way where it's like, you don't, like, everyone's not just going to stack one spot. You're going to have to kind of naturally, as players, want to set it up so that no matter, in a way, no matter what you choose, there's always a way to climb back a little bit back into the game, which is a nice aspect of the game. Because the other fun, or the other part, which we didn't quite talk about yet, is the money, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, right, stocks, you're trying to make money. You're trying to be the richest person here out of this game. So when you're doing the bids, you're bidding your money in order
Mm.
to get these stocks. So you're
Right.
actually bidding your end game points effectively to try to make more over time, right? So it's kind of like investments, right? You're putting forward money to get these to get the stockpile to build your portfolio, so that eventually it grows into making you even more money later. But you have to be smart about it, because if you spend too much money on these stockpiles with an assumption that you're going to make a lot out of it, but then your portfolio starts dropping and the company starts busting because either, bad forecasts or players messing you up, you're going to have to pivot and you're going to have to switch, right? And that's the other fun part too, where it's like you can build multiple, company stocks, right, in your portfolios over time. So I think
Oh
that part is
man.
really fun about this too.
Yeah,
So
there's like 3 or 4 things that came to mind when you're talking just now that were really cool about it. Like, for one, I think it's a really good mechanic of the bidding, not just the excitement of it, but something that if we didn't make clear, there's only going to be so many stockpiles as there are a number of players.
yeah.
And I think that's smart because it's that kind of case where it's not a game that gives you like multiple options and you just choose which one's good for you, and then someone else maybe thinks it's good for them, so they fight you for it. But it's more that everyone has this limited set of choices, so they're all going to be taken at the end.
Hmm.
And so it's kind of this restricted options, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a smart way of doing it, not just like too many options and too much freedom with that.
Hmm.
And then another thing you pointed out was um the investment of, like, you're basically spending your money to hopefully make more money, right? Which is like in real life, right? But it's in a gaming setting, it's that mechanic of using your points, like your victory points, to actually try to get more victory points later, which
Hmm.
I think is it's a cool mechanic because it can be tense for people, right? To think about, ooh, like I'm actually giving up my lead currently by going down in victory points and
Yeah.
hoping it pans out. But then the cool thing about it also is that even though you're like kind of investing in that way, you don't have to. I would say you don't have to think too much about it,
Yeah.
because obviously, like, some people might want to analyze a lot of like calculating, like, oh, if I'm bidding this much money and I know there's these stocks in it and they're worth this much and I could sell it and make this much, like that is kind of the smart way to play about it. But then I think 2 things get in the way of that, where you mentioned like the forecast at the end, right?
Hmm.
Like you could see the price now, but you don't know how much those stocks that you want are going to be worth later. And then the other part with that is human greed. Because basically you could, like, you could plan, you could calculate it so that if I sell the stocks at this price, it'll give me this much net profit, right, over how much I'm bidding. But then it's like, what if it gets to the selling phase and you choose not to sell? And you're like, oh, maybe the stock will just
I
go up and I can
wait.
sell next round. Oh, maybe it'll go up even more and I can sell next round. But eventually you're going to run out of rounds, or the forecast is not going to go that way. And then you
Hmm.
just waited and
Yeah.
it actually ended up worse for you, right? And so all those things in those phases you mentioned, I think are really cool. both thematically, right? It does have that light sense of like, yeah, investing and how to actually plan with the information, the limited information you have. And yeah, I think those are thematic things that are cool, but work very well mechanically in the game.
And on that point, I was going to say it's also really nice to know how many turns. Like it's a very clear cut. There are only this many turns in the game, as you were mentioning in the board, right? Because it's not a game that prolongs. And so, like we've talked about some Euro games and some point scoring games in the past, where the game keeps going until a certain condition is triggered, right? But in this game, there's no conditions that are triggered other than the fact that this many turns have passed, and then that's it, right? Like there's no choice. You just it's at this point. This is when the stock market is basically done, and you have to kind of report out who's the richest guy, or girl, or gal. Yes, there are female characters. So,
but yeah, I mean, yeah, unlike other popular board games like Monopoly or Risk, where it's like you need to be the last one standing, and I'm like, oh gosh.
right, exactly. So
yeah, so that set time limit is good. It's just simple and clean. And then I think the part that I enjoy the most, even also thematically, is the later phases of a round where the selling and the forecast or revealing the information, or it's called the movement phase, where you move the prices. Because I think like that's just a smart way to do it, where I think when I teach people it the first time, they might always kind of think about it or question it a little bit. It's like, wait, I'm selling and then moving, but like that's the whole tenseness of like the stock market, right? Like you have to choose when is the right time to sell, and you don't know what's going to happen next. Except in this game, you do, right? The forecast is not even like a possibility. Like you know it's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
The information you have, the information everyone else has, but it's just more like that order is just so smart at the very end of the phase, where it's like you have to choose to sell now or else it's going to change, and you might not know how it's going to change, right? So that's just
or
like
you
thematic.
might.
Yeah, you might.
Insider info.
which is the brilliant part. You just know one thing that will happen, and you have to decide then, ooh, do I sell now or do I wait and see how it moves? And that's like tense. But then also that's another part where I know you mentioned in the earlier phases where like reading how people are bidding. This is where you would start reading how people are selling, right? Because then turn order wise, you're going in turn order to sell. And so you'll see someone like, oh, I'm selling all my leading lags. Like, whoa, wait, what? It's like, is it because you just need money, or you like the price, or you know it's gonna like somehow die drastically
exactly.
in the next phase? And so that's a fun moment, and like that's when you can kind of mess with people too, right? Where like even like not selling all your leading lags, but like they don't know how many you have actually, right? They just see your piles of stocks face down. But like maybe for you, or if someone was counting the stocks you had, counting cards, you'll be like, I'm selling 2 of my 4 leading labs. It's like, you guys figure out what that means, you know?
Exactly. Or it's like someone decides to sell the split stock of it, right? The split, and it's like, wait, split stocks are really strong. Why would you be selling it? Why didn't you sell it maybe last turn when it was still at a really high price? Do you know something about it? And then you have to start asking that question, like, ooh, should I be selling it now, or should I, what do I do? Yeah, that's also a really fun part.
And so overall, I don't know if you have more pros to say. I mean, I would just say overall, one general pro is like the flow of the game goes really well, like these phases we just mentioned. But for me, it'll come up later too. It's a pro and a con. But it's a pro in that when you're playing it, it's just smooth, right? Like when you're saying it's like, yeah, just 6 phases in a round, and you repeat that for however many rounds, and you just go through each step really clear. But then going on to the cons, I guess I will just mention that one again now. It is a con because whenever I've taught the game, it can kind of sound daunting to people when I'm like, yeah, the game is played in say like 3 rounds, and every round is 6 phases. Like, whoa, like math-wise, that's like 18 things we gotta go through, But and especially when you're reading through the rules, like they're not badly written rules at all. Like honestly, they're not. And they even have a watch it played video you could watch to learn the rules, which are always done really well by Rodney Smith. But the rules are like really clean. I don't want to drop anything, but yeah, like really clean, good images of what it's referring to. But as you can see, it can seem like a lot of text, right? Especially if you're the one learning it to teach people. It can seem like you're reading through quite a bit, trying to remember the small cases that can happen of like what happens with a split stock or what happens when that splits again. You know, like those small rules that you need to read because they will probably come up. And so it can feel like a lot, it sound like a lot, but then when you actually explain it, as I've then moved on to do in teaching, there is just the back, which is a reference of each phase. And then it becomes much easier to summarize for people, you know, of like, you just deal these out, this is your insider information. You create these stockpiles and then you start outbidding each other on them to get whatever cards are there. And so over time it gets faster, but when you're first just saying it out of these phases, it can feel like a lot for people. But yeah, any from you, John?
Yeah, so then cons wise, I don't think these are like serious or like game kind of breaking or pain inspiring cons. But one of the things I would say, and we were actually kind of discussing it a little bit before, is components wise, the money cards are a little bit kind of funky feeling. So there they are physically. The pro of them being as they are is the fact that they're actually cards and not like paper, as I think Ben was bringing up when we had chatted about it. And you know that's a pro to it, but it also feels weird because they're so small. The cards are kind of like the money is kind of this small shape, which is not. I think maybe it's just this attribute of what is money, where it doesn't kind of have that sense or that feel like if it was a coin shape, for example, like people associate the coin shape with money, or metallic, then that would be associated with money. Or like paper, while component-wise, paper is not the greatest to use in board games, it is associated with money. So like in games, like I know we bring this up as a joke a lot, like Monopoly or Game of Life and stuff. It's a joke to us a bit, but it's also like it has that weight of, or the association of being money. But in this game, the way the cards are shaped, kind of, they don't really pop out as like, this is money, this is valuable, this is important. It's almost like, oh, this is just another card that I'm holding on to. When in reality, like the money cards are like the end game, right? These are kind of the most important cards for you to have at the end of this game, because if you don't have money, right? And you can also have money through the stocks, but like you do sell a lot in this game, so you will be collecting quite a number of these, you know, money cards over time. And it's almost like, for the importance of what these cards have, they ironically don't feel big enough for us, or they don't feel special enough, right? So we were actually kind of talking about why that felt the case, or what could have improved it. And so there was a couple things we threw around. One, obviously, is just make it a bigger card. It's like just slightly larger, so then it kind of has more importance, because it's like half the size of every other card. Even the next smallest card is like, it's more than half reduced to the other cards, right? So
Yeah,
you
like
know,
this is a
maybe make
stock
it slightly
card
larger, right?
compared to money card.
Exactly. And then one of the things I was considering is maybe some type of an embossing, or like popping out of maybe the money, like the numerical values on those cards, just so that it has that different textured feel to it. Again, production wise, I'm no expert in the space. Also in the design space, I'm also not an expert, so I could totally be wrong about this.
I do like how they do have like different colors. I know I was just showing like blue and green, which doesn't look that different, but they actually are different colors, so it is visible. But yeah, there is something with the size of like when you're counting your money at the end, you just have like this one pile of all these small little cards, and you're like counting. It's like, it's just not that impactful feeling in a way.
Yeah.
And I have small hands, so like this is a real like size comparison. I'm like, they went with the small cards, and it's like, I mean, I can imagine also going with like a card the same size stock would be a little annoying, because especially if you like accidentally mix it, right? They're like the same size. But yeah, some kind of bigger card maybe for the money, with a fancy little embossing or something, making it feel like money, fancier. For me, actually, one of the bigger cons is actually the portfolio board, which each player gets to track their stocks. And the issue, I mean, one of the good things, and it took me actually a really long time to notice this. I don't know, maybe I just didn't read the rules thoroughly, which is possible, but the side of each board actually lists the name of each of the phases. It's kind of blurry, but like information, supply, demand, action, selling, movement. So then you know, like, you have a small reminder of the phases of each round. And then on the side here, it actually has a breakdown of like each of the possible forecast cards in the base game. The expansion adds actually a lot more, so then it becomes kind of irrelevant. But at least in the base game, it's cool to know. It's a little simple way to track of like the possible forecasts that are dealt out every round. But then one of the negatives about this, sorry, is, I mean, we were talking about it, where like having the phases written out here is nice if you notice it, but then still to know what to do on each phase when you're playing the game for the first few times, that it doesn't help, right? It just kind of tells you to then look it up at the back of the rule book, which, you know, you might be doing anyway. Where then if each character, I mean, if each player could have like a card that summarized it, you know, maybe like 3 phases on one side, 3 phases on the other, and just a summary of what you're doing in there, that might be more helpful for each player, just to know what's going to happen next, to kind of see forward. I mean, admittedly, not everyone needs to, because you could have someone who's teaching it just, you know, help set up each phase and remind you each time. But the less you have to remind people, the better, right? They can just kind of know what's going to happen. But and then the other negative, the bigger one, is this is the left side is where you put your single stocks face down, and the right side is where you put your split stock face down. And it's like, it's just, this is just a piece of cardboard. There's no like double layer, no indentation. And so you're kind of just putting it on here and like hoping it doesn't like slide or even mix with each other. And so you want to be careful with that.
Unless
It's
you
a
want it
fiddly
to mix
aspect.
with each other.
Oh no,
Cheaters.
all my stocks were on the right side and they were already split. Like that, I think that's kind of an issue for people, or at least I've never had it be an issue, but people are worried about it, right? Like they'll put the board in front of them and just hope not to touch it unless you need to. And then to have the system too, where when your stock splits because the company price reaches its end, you just move it into this pile. It's like, I don't know, could there have been a way to indicate a split stock better than just using the same card? I mean, it's simpler to use the same card, but then that sets you up for this kind of confusion of like both the cards sliding into each other, but also when you're counting your stock, you probably only pick up one pile first and count it, put it back, and then count the second pile, right? You don't hold both in the same hand because then you just mixed it up.
Because then you mix them up. Yeah, exactly. So that is also kind of an unfortunate aspect of that. It's also one of the important rules of, or one of the rules of, what do you do with a split stock when the company splits again, right?
Yeah,
That's not
yeah.
really
So
clear at all within the board, as we were just talking about. There's no indication on the board itself of what you might want to do or what you were supposed to do, which I believe it's what you get dividends out of it.
Yeah, or you get like, I think you get a straight 10K.
Or you get a like just an extra 10K
Yeah,
out of it.
for each split card you have,
Yeah,
but not like each split, not each
value.
double stock, right?
So it's like a card that is in the split section.
Yeah,
One card gets you 10K. When it
yeah.
splits again, it doesn't give you 20K because it's it's valued as 2 stocks, right?
Yeah.
So that's slightly confusing, right? That's not quite
Yeah.
intuitive in when you think about it. Like you would think if you had something that was in split, if you split it again, you get 4, right? That would be like what you would think in a real situation or like in the context of what happens, but that's not what happens. You would also snowball like crazy if that happened.
Yeah.
And at that point, then it's just like, oh, this game's maybe not so balanced if they did that.
And I mean, and so that goes into like the component wise that I was just mentioning, right? Where it's like, I mean, maybe the creator designer, you know, did a lot of play testing on that, where it's like, you know, it's still cleaner to just move the card over as the split stock. But I do wonder if it's like, what if there was like a separate, you know, supply of cards that are just extra copies, where then once it splits, you add a second one or something, but
or
that might
or
make
you
too
replace
many
the
cards.
card as a ×2 card.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
It
Actually,
shows
yeah,
like
that's
two of
true.
them or
Yeah, and
something,
that would
like
be
two
easier to
images.
read, right? It'd have the ×2 on the back or something.
Yeah.
But that might be adding too many components that would be more annoying to produce. You know what I mean? Of like
Mhm.
doing so much playtesting that's like, okay, we figured out we need like 20 extra copies of all of these
Yeah.
double split cups. It's like, I don't know. What if someone goes beyond that? Then component wise, that also gets annoying. So I don't know a good way to get around that. And then I think.
And then, so I was going to say one other con from a
Mm,
base game standpoint, which I think the expansion kind of fixes, because I believe you were saying there's a dice involved with it. But there
mhm.
is with the forecasting, as you were mentioning, it is simple, so there is a nicety to it being simple. But there's also a certain point where it's also almost like it's always the same up and down, which is also kind of, it feels like a little too artificial is actually the ultimate feeling. So maybe the first time or second time you're playing it, it's like, oh, this is really cool, right? This concept of it going up and down. But then you kind of start realizing it only goes down in increments of 2 and 3. And it only goes up in
Mhm.
increments of 1, 2, and 4. There's no like +3, or there's no like, some other, variation. Or what if there were like multiple +1s that could happen in a turn, right? Like the variation in ups and downs of the cards of the stock market with the way that it plays out with the card base in the base game, it's very kind of staged in that way.
Mhm.
So and it can affect from luck of the draw that there were, I think there was a couple games we played where there was a company that ended up getting +4 like 3 or 4 times, right? And it's just like, what do you do about that? It's kind of one of those situations where it's just like, well, I guess everybody's just gonna go for that one because it's like open, it's in the open shared information +4
Mm.
every single time. So it's just like, well, yeah, of course I'm probably like most of the time you're gonna be like probably competing with other people on that one because it's such a high value stock. And there are the other ones that are also positives, but like that's just like, I know that is the highest value version. So it kind of does, kind of promote or push a particular kind of direction for people to buy or try to bid, right? And I know we talked about ways to mitigate that with the way you set up the stockpiles and things like that, but there's a point where variation and variability of the changes is overall ultimately pretty staged because these are the primary ways of the stockpile changes. But that's base game. So
Yeah, and I agree. I did feel that even after maybe playing it like a handful of times, right? If you play it kind of quite a bit all at once, that there is definitely that feeling where it's like it's just those six possibilities, and they're always going to come out every round, whether
mhm.
to players or to open information. And so something, yeah, the expansion. I'm pulling it up right now. The first expansion, there are actually two, but the first one called Continuing Corruption. This one actually adds other modules to the game that you could choose which ones you want to add in or not. So it's not like some big expansion, you just have to add everything. But the one that I basically, after I got the expansion, the one I always play with and teach from the beginning now is the forecast dice.
Mhm.
So there are 6 dice. And so at the start of each round, instead of just randomly dealing out those 6 cards, which are always going to be dealt out, you roll these 6 dice and you basically pull out the forecast cards that correspond to the value on them. And then that's what you're actually dealing out to each player that round. And so these, I did pull out the die that has positive and negative. So it is possible that in one round you could have 5 things that are positive and just one negative. And the
Or
values are even
five
different.
negatives.
Yeah, I don't think that can happen, but I think you maybe have like 3 negative,
Yeah.
right? Three negative, 3 positive. And so in that case, like I think that variety just helps the game a lot.
Mhm.
That there is definitely that, in a sense, like it adds to that sense of unpredictability,
Mhm.
but you still know one thing.
Yep.
And so that keeps the variety in the game. Actually, and then something I did want to mention that might be a negative or might be positive for some people It's just a very slight negative for me, just because it seems like an extra rule that I don't want to learn or teach to people. So I actually haven't played with it. Is in the base game, there is a module of the investors. And let me see if I have some of those here. Like Billionaire Bill and Discount Donald. Oh, I think we might know who. Dividend Deborah. So like all these obviously, play on real people who have money. Oprah, opulent Oprah. Basically, this is a module in the base game that you can choose to play with if you want, and it's basically just during setup you deal out an investor to each person, and that's basically who you are, right? Not just this you as a private investor, but you are playing this person who then starts out with certain bonuses. Like Billionaire Bill has no ability, but he just starts out with $32,000, so a lot more than everyone. And then, some people have like different abilities that you kind of have to learn, which aren't bad because there's probably just a page in the rules to look it up. But I think just with everything I've said about like teaching the phases of the game, getting the feel of it, and then adding this other thing that could introduce an ability or just this difference, to me it might feel like a bit much for players. It's something that I would be okay with playing with now, since like I'm so familiar with the game, but as something to also introduce, it might be a little much. So it might be a negative for you or positive, depending on how much you want to introduce that kind of player variability. Variety.
Yep.
But yeah, it's just a very slight negative for me because I'm just like, I don't want to teach it.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like it's one of those things where it's like if you're playing a game and people have all kind of learned and figured out how the game plays, and it's all the same action, so to speak, right? Because everyone ultimately does have the same turns, the same things to do during a turn in action. This gives you a little bit more variability or differentiation of players, right? So you don't all start off in the same boat, because the positive in that side, so kind of speaking to that slight positive side of it, is if you play purely as a base, then it's really up to the selection of your drafting and then the auctions that really determine the differences of how people kind of are making money. But if you start out with a different situation, right, that kind of gives you maybe an edge in a particular strategic way, that might help you kind of get over maybe some of those humps that from placements, right, and drafting may change how you do your drafting, right? So it's like it's a very small change, but I think I agree in the sense with Ben of like you don't need it, right? It's not something you need to have in this game. It's nice to have. It's great that they have the option, the availability, but even as a base game in and of itself, like you don't need these things to still have a good time with the game.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I was thinking the exact same thing when you're talking. Yeah, maybe it's not even a slight negative; it's just a neutral thing for me, where it's like it's there, and maybe it's positive for you, maybe it's negative because it could be confusing. I don't know, but yeah, it's the fact that like the game with everything we described so far is already like enough of an experience that I could easily play Stockpile like once or twice in a game night. Just like back-to-back game, just with whatever we just taught as the rules, and that's enough of an experience. And so with that,
I'm surprised you didn't say anything about the borders of these cards.
Well, I don't know. Why do you have an issue with the border on
no,
the cards?
I was just joking because I know we talked about it in the last video. Wonder Second Edition, right? Not the full
but
art.
I actually do think like from the picture that you have in the background showing the components, it has a very nice look to it, like not the borders, but I mean like the colors and the art style, right? Yeah. Like it's very full, right? Even with the borders, it's like barely there, but like with the investor artwork, the different stock artwork, like it's a really colorful looking game for a stock game, where when I hear the idea of a stock game, I would imagine just like this, like that green, the stock boost boom card, it's like this green grid with like arrows and graphs, that's what I would imagine. But it's very colorful for a stock game. And actually a final kind of neutral point, I guess, because it's positive and negative. in my mind is that I mentioned at the very beginning of this review that not to be scared away if you're scared of stocks, or not to be too excited if you're into stocks, because I think the game plays like a game, right? It's not the same as a stock market where it's like, I think the excitement, from like constantly keeping track and then, selling, bidding, buying like as soon as you can. None of that, right? It's in a game format, right? So it has rounds and its own pace, but it's also not like this huge like idea of, predicting things and models and graphs that people might think of who aren't into stocks, right? That they might just think like, oh, it might even be just like Monopoly or something, like another money game. And so that's why it's interesting for me, where it's like, no, it's like a very solid stock game, but then don't get distracted by how much you're into or not into stocks, right? So, yeah, that's kind of my thought on it. And I think it's solid, definitely solid for what it is. My version has I think this was on Kickstarter, and this company, Nauvoo Games, only has like a few games out so far. This came out probably, I think, maybe a few years ago, like 5 years ago, maybe. But my version has the Dice Tower Seal of Excellence, which means Tom Bassel really liked it. I think it's one of his top like stock money games. And I do agree with that too. Like, this game is very different from like thematically from most of my games.
Yep.
I can't think of other games that I have that are really like, because it's not even a, trading in the Mediterranean or resource management game, right? I would clearly call it a stock game because that's how you're going about the resources in it. And so, yeah, it's very different. And I think it's done really well.
It's not like Bargain Quest where you invest in your adventurers.
That's a clever theme on its own, which we will talk about in the future.
We'll talk about that one another time.
Because that one definitely plays differently, right?
Yeah. I joke about it. Just because you give people money in that one too, or get money.
And so now we'll move on to the last parts of our review, where John will share his score and guess the weight.
Yeah, so score-wise, I would probably rate this at an 8, actually.
Okay.
As a game. I rated that as
Solid.
an 8. And weight, I would probably say maybe 2.25. No, just kidding. 2.2.
2.2. Actually, do you want to explain why you give it an 8? Because that is above average, right?
Yeah.
Slightly.
So I give it an 8 because I think, as we were talking about, I think it's a very solid game. I think there's a lot going for it. It's actually pretty quick, or pretty simple to pick up. It's not a very difficult game in that way to really pick up. There is complexity involved, which is why, from the weight standpoint, I think it's higher than just a straight 2, because that's kind of where I was bordering on. But there is some complexity behind the auctioning and the relation, like the kind of manipulating and figuring out the numbers. And then in terms of just, approachability, as we were saying, I feel like a lot of the negatives that we had aren't really about the mechanics of the game, right? It's more of these kind of like the cards themselves, or like the components specifically. And there is some oddities on some of the rules that need to be learned. But if you know the game, right, if you actually know how to play the game and you're taking it just as what the game and how the game should be played, it is a very solid, very well-made game in that concept, in that perspective, which is why I do think it's really high up there. And again, weight-wise, complexity-wise, I think it's something that a lot of people can easily get into and easily play, pick up, and want to play again or try again. Again, especially like not just with this variability, but for example, adding in the dice variability if you have that expansion, right? Because then that really gives you different variety on how the game will actually play out with the stocks and how they grow or or bust over time. So that's why I give it an 8.
And so actually, yeah, just since you mentioned like the dice again from the first expansion, the continuing corruption, know that there was a second one called illicit investments. That's the final expansion for it. And so they all add their own modules, which if you find them interesting, especially thematically, I think they are all thematic at least, right? There are things that are worth putting into the game. I just haven't tried anything much than the forecast dice, but there's also like loans you can take where you can get money quickly, but then eventually have to pay it back. And so there, that adds another bit of the planning. And then there's also, uh, I think there's like certain, investment strategy cards, which from the second expansion, which I haven't even looked at. So there's a lot you can add to it if this is a theme that actually interests you. And so for me, my score, and to verify John's weight, or the weight John gave for it, not your actual weight,
Wait.
of Stockpile, going to Board Game Geek, we have 2.11. Very
I was
close.
actually thinking 2.1, but well, maybe 2.2.
Oh gosh, so close. I felt like I had to buy you the copy of the game, but nope, you're wrong.
Yay! Yeah.
And my score is an 8, also coincidentally.
Copy me.
Actually, but every time I kind of look at the game again and kind of thinking of what I was mentioning last of it being such a different theme from almost all my games, and like it has a good look, right? Like even just the box cover image here, like has a really full art, kind of warm colorful, bringing it into this kind of like, kind of little techie, modern, that kind of feel for the stock market. I think it really stands out for me. I would give it like, I mean, I technically could, but I rather give like in 0.5 increments. It would go towards like 0.5, but round down to an 8. But it is more than an 8 for me, uh, in my mind, because I think it is not only above average, but even slightly more than the games I normally think of above average. Because it is a game that I do suggest a lot too, and I think that for me is a sign of how much it sticks out to me, how much it can introduce like a really well-running board game with an interesting theme to people who are new to board games. And so so that's why it is an 8 for me currently. And so if for anyone who is interested in this game, keep in mind actually that I think a while back, since I've backed the other Kickstarters for the expansions, I do get like updates from this company. And so Nauvoo Games a while back, maybe with the last Kickstarter, was saying that I think Stockpile is not going to be printed anymore, if I remember correctly. So it's something that isn't widely available anymore. Maybe primarily just through the company's website. And it's kind of I think it's called the Epic Edition, which is basically the game with all the expansions and like a new rule book, which includes all the expansion rules put into the right places of it. So that was really cool of them to do. But it was sad for me to hear a while back of like, oh man, this game that, got such a good review from Dice Tower, I really like it, stands out a lot. It's like not going to be available to people anymore. That's unfortunate.
And then you can show off a little bit because you're like, I have a copy of
Yeah,
such
I
an
have
amazing
everything.
game.
But yeah, so if you guys did find this interesting, both the theme and how it plays, like definitely I want to encourage you to play it, to find someone who has it, to try it, maybe even get yourself a copy if you are that interested in it, because it might be harder to get later on, or maybe even kind of hard to get now. Yeah, I think it was that it's going out of print or they're not printing anymore. I'm sorry if I'm wrong, but at least that's what I remember sticking out to me, the availability being much less in the future. And so, so if you guys found this helpful, interesting, please share this video, this review with your friends, family, and hope to have you back for our next review. So until then, see you next time. Bye.
Bye.